Welcome back to the Unnamed Game Co. Worldbuilding Series, Episode 6. Okay, so how? Part 5, Geography. Title's still too long, but we are rolling with it. My name is Caradwin, they, them pronouns, and if you haven't seen Episode 1 through 5, you're actually probably good to dive in right here, because a lot of world builders don't start with all the stuff that I started with. A lot of world builders just start with a map and then fill it in. But today we're going to talk about more than just a map. We're going to talk about geography. So, as is tradition, we start with a definition. What is geography? The study of the physical features of the Earth and its atmosphere, and of human activity as it affects and is affected by these, including the distribution of populations and resources, land use, and industries. And for the first time in this series, I have nothing to add to this definition. Nothing to clarify, nothing to expand on. This definition is exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about geography. I'm talking about more than the map. Geography is the landscape, and most conflicts are shaped by the geographical features that people are trying to acquire or the resources within those geographical features. The landscape also affects weather, and weather really changes your cultures. You're going to have different kinds of people who live in different places, different rituals and practices that rise because of the landscape and the weather that are there. Also, catastrophes and conflicts literally shape the landscape of the world. So when you have a major conflict or a war, there's going to be changes to the landscape. And I'm not just talking about contemporary stuff like nuclear bombs and the unexploded mines in no man's land in France. I'm talking about there are hills in England which are actually just land masses that built up on top of old fortifications. Like, we have literally physically changed the landscape of the world that we live in through our societies and our conflicts. And you can incorporate that kind of stuff into your tabletop role-playing game. Which I know sounds daunting, but it's also super rewarding. So when we're thinking about our geography in our tabletop role-playing games, we're thinking about the consequences of the features on humans, and we're also thinking about how our humans are going to have consequences to our features. And we're thinking about how the people interact with those features. What kinds of things people do in those places and how it shapes who they are and how they function. We're going to start off with a real-world example. I'm going to tell you about the Crusader States. Now, I'm not an expert in the Crusades, so I'm probably going to mispronounce things, and I'm definitely going to be glossing over some stuff, but I think it's really important to give you some of the historical context so that you understand the significance of this geography. Back in 1087, Seljuks captured Jerusalem from the Fatimids of Egypt, and the Byzantine emperor got scared because they shared a lot of border with this area, and they reached out to the West and said, hey, help us. And then 8 years later, Pope Urban II gives this amazing speech at the Council of Clermont in France, and in November of 1095, a Crusader army of 60,000, quote, fighters and 6,000 knights set off for Jerusalem. To call them fighters is really generous. They were kind of just normal people, and they were going on this sort of pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which happens to also involve, murder and pillaging. Anyway, if you are sitting there thinking to yourself, well, that seems like a weird set of circumstances, it is. There's a lot of interesting history that went into making the Crusades happen, but that's not what this is about. I want to talk about the geography of this and how we got the Crusader States. So because this, quote, army, quote, was put together in the way that it wasn't actually an army. They didn't have ranks or orders or anything like that. So over the course of traversing through Germany, where they did a lot of wholesale slaughter, and then starving their way through the Byzantine Empire, because the Byzantine Emperor was like, who are you people? What are you doing here? I asked for help like 8 years ago. Anyway, so they pretty much starved until they finally got their passage into the Middle East. So across this journey, there were these 4 people who kind of rose to power. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that there were 4 Crusader states because there were these 4 big personalities. The County of Edessa was founded by Baldwin, and the Principality of Antioch was founded by Bohemond, which I'm probably mispronouncing, and then the County of Tripoli founded by Raymond, and then the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was ruled over by Godfrey. Now, the names of these places are very important. Baldwin was Count. Bohemond made himself a prince. He could have gone with the same tradition and called it a County of Antioch, but he decided the Principality of Antioch to call himself the Prince, which is pretty badass. And then the County of Tripoli was kind of ruled over by Raymond, who was already a count back home. And then the Kingdom of Jerusalem, where Godfrey did not want to be the king and chose to be called the Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. After Godfrey's death, however, the title of King of Jerusalem was passed over by other crusade leaders, and eventually Baldwin became the King of Jerusalem. Can you imagine being the guy who was like, yeah, I'm King of the Holy Land? The arrogance. Anyway, Interesting naming conventions aside, one of the most interesting things about the Crusader States is how long they lasted. The Crusader States went from about 1098 through 1291. That's almost 200 years, which is pretty freaking incredible. That's really, really amazing. And one of the reasons why it's so amazing is because the Crusader States were so small. They were really few in number. They didn't have a big population of Crusaders, and yet they were able to maintain this massive amount of land compared to their size. And one of the reasons why they were able to do this was because they maintained the trade relations. They thrived in this environment despite not being from here, despite being literally invaders who had murdered their way into possession of this land. They managed to maintain the trade relationships and continue to prosper, which is just bonkers banana sauce. And there are a lot of reasons why this was possible. And one of the big reasons is the innovations that came out of the necessities that were presented by this geography. For example, you couldn't exactly just carry a bag of gold from one place to another and just not get robbed. That wasn't reasonable. It wasn't safe to do that because the Crusaders, weren't really powerful. So instead, they would send pieces of paper that said, I promise, if you take these goods to this place, you will get money from this person. This was the check. Now, the check had already existed in the East for a long time in a couple different forms, but the concept of a check was really new to the European people. And for those of you who are young, a check is a piece of paper that you would write out to Venmo people money. I am so old. Anyway, so these innovations with, technology and naval vessels and commerce and economy radically changed the landscape of Europe, not to mention all of the innovations. At this time, what we now think of as the Middle East was really, really prosperous. They were super good at advancing technology. They were very advanced socially and scientifically. They had public schools and healthcare and things like that in a way that we just did not have in Europe. And because of the access to all of this information now through the Crusader States, there's a big boom and rise in education and access to technology and science. I'm not a historian, but it's possible to draw a line from the Crusades to the early Renaissance. We probably would not have had Leonardo da Vinci if we hadn't first had the Crusader States. And all of this has to do with the geography. Looking at a modern map, you can see these land bridges at Istanbul and Egypt and into the Middle East. These land bridges are absolutely vital to human history because you couldn't get from Africa, which was incredibly resource rich, into Europe, which was, slightly resource deficient because cold, unless you traversed across these land bridges. The one of them through Egypt, up through what we have now, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and into Turkey, through Istanbul, into Europe. That's why there are so many massive conflicts in this area throughout history. We did not have the ability to just send boats places. We didn't have airplanes. We had to walk. And because of that, these places became centers of trade. They became hugely important for many societies, many cultures, many religions, many governments. And these pivotal points generated so much history. You can create that in your world. Geography isn't the map. Geography is how we interact with the map. Geography is how we have our motivations displayed before us, what our values are, what drives us to go places and do things. It's the people who live there, who interact with the spaces, the cultures that rise up from them based on where they are in the world. And the geography also drives innovations. We develop technology as a necessity to overcome the obstacles of our geography. Boats, planes, trains, submarines, automobiles, drones. We build all of this stuff because we cannot navigate our landscape in other ways. The internet exists because we need to get information from one place to another very rapidly, and these places have become farther and farther apart. So geography drives innovation, and that also creates change. As we interact with our environments, we are also changing internally and externally. We are becoming different in our mindset and how we view the world and what we value based on where we are. Scarcities and opportunities, innovations, communications, all of this changes who we are as people. So when you're building your tabletop role-playing game, you need to be thinking about some of these things as well. How is your map going to change your world? How is your world going to affect what happens with your geography? Pause for dramatic effect complete. Now let's talk about some of the pitfalls of geography. One of the things that we find a lot in our sci-fi and fantasy games are the complicated names. Also in general, just lack of meaningful design choices, lack of complexity. So let's start with the names. The names are easier. So I am by no means an expert in Game of Thrones, but I really like the naming conventions. The general goal for your name is that it's going to be an interesting, pronounceable name that is meaningful, or at least evocative of what you're trying to get from the place that you're naming. So in Game of Thrones, we have Westeros, which is to the west, and Essos, which is to the east, which to a native English speaker, that's going to make a lot of sense. And then the names of the places within these two continents are very representative of where they are and the people who are in them. So because Westeros is kind of loosely based on European fantasy, we have names like King's Landing, Highgarden, River Run. These are evocative of the natural elements around them. King's Landing is where you land boats because it's a port city and the king lives there, so it's King's Landing. And in some ways this may feel like a cop-out when you're naming things, but how many places in America are called Springfield because they had fields and springs? How many places are named Middletown because they are the town between two other major towns? We tend to name things after what they are, so King's Landing makes a lot of sense, but it also sounds cool. Highgarden, pretty self-explanatory. River Run, pretty self-explanatory. So you understand these geographical features and these elements that you're going to find in these different places. And some of the more evocative names, I think, are like Iron Islands, which doesn't necessarily tell you about, what it is. We know it's an island, but iron, that brings to mind certain feels, certain vibe, a mood. Same kind of thing with Dragonstone. You get this totally different perspective versus Iron Island and Dragonstone. You know that these are going to be different kind of places, different vibes. And Winterfell, I think, is sort of the crowning achievement where it not only tells you this is a cold place, but it's also fell. It's got this darkness, this dreariness, this sadness, and you get this idea that it's a place in decline. All of these sort of Western traditional style names are contrasted by the kingdoms in Essos, which have very foreign names because this is a foreign place. So the naming conventions within the worlds are helping to show the reader sort of intuitively that these are other places, these are different. And the names here are really cool, like Vest Dothrak. I might not know the language of the Dothraki people, but I know that this has a very harsh and exciting kind of romantic barbarian vibe to it, and it meshes, it matches, it makes sense, especially in contrast to some place like Quarth. They're very, very different sounding because they're very, very different places, and the people who populate them and the societies that build them up are obviously different. My favorite place name from Game of Thrones is Braavos because it's really evocative of the people who live there. They are brave, they are brash, they are brazen, they are bold, and you get all of that tied into that Braavos. It makes sense when you meet the people who are from Braavos, and the kind of personality that they embody is really represented by the name of that place. Now, obviously there are exceptions. Not every person from every place is going to be an exemplar of, the theme that their name conveys. But in general, you get broad stroke, intuitive understandings of what these different places are. This becomes a little more complicated if, you're trying to run games for people from multiple linguistic backgrounds. But in broad strokes, when you're playing a game, writing a world for people who share your language, these kinds of naming conventions are very effective. All of these names are interesting. They are mostly pronounceable. The ones that are harder to pronounce are foreign and different, so that kind of helps build into that meaningfulness or the evocative nature of the names. But there is also something to be said for, calling your place Doritoville, because your players will remember Doritoville. So it doesn't all have to be serious. You can have some more silly, more lighthearted names. I love giving my NPCs names like Jim, because it's sometimes nice and refreshing to have something that's a little more simple. All right, moving on. So let's look at some meaningless geography. Let me start by saying that I'm not trying to rag on the person who made this. This was just a free map that was available on a clip art site. Obviously the person who was making this was not intending to create a world for world building. But this is an example of the kind of thing that sometimes I see when people are showing me their maps for their worlds. And just as another point, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You can create a simple map and just run it and not worry about all of these details and nuance that I'm getting into. That's fine. You don't have to be like me. You can do what you want to do, and can you have fun on a map like this? Sure. Does a map like this support a really compelling world? Not really. At least not in my opinion. I could make it work, but I don't think that it's a great jumping off point. So when I look at this map, what I see are two sort of categories where there's the physical, natural phenomena, and then there are the civilizations. And there's a little bit of confusion about the map in general because you have this white part up by the little camp, which would indicate snow, but the rest of the camp is brown. Same color as the desert. So maybe it's all desert, except for the little tree parts. Not really sure what to make about that. Maybe that's nitpicking. In broader strokes, the most interesting things that I see about these physical features from the natural world are these forests and the mountains. I don't really know what to make of the desert, because normally deserts don't like just chill in the middle and then run into a forest before becoming mountains. Normally it's just like desert, mountains. But again, splitting hairs, maybe there's a reason for it. The most interesting thing that I see are these 3 little clustered trees in the middle here, because they are a forest that separate these 2 kingdoms. The kingdoms are separated by the mountains and this forest. So if these mountains are difficult to traverse, you would have these like very treacherous, easily defensible valleys in between the big mountains, and the bulk of any sort of like attack or surprise force from one kingdom to the other would have to go through that forest. And that would be very interesting. Like, what if you were a group of elves who lived in that forest between these 2 warring nations who were trying to take over the forest so that they could get to each other more easily? That's interesting. And you can easily see some reasons why that inner kingdom might want to go to war, because they don't have a coastline. They don't have access to the bounty of the ocean. Maybe there's like a reason that they want to get away from the desert because of the witches and stuff up north of it. Like, that's all pretty interesting. I'm down for that. But if your game is actually about the wizard tower to the north of the desert, then cool. Why did you put all of this time and energy into making all this cool potential conflict stuff down to the south? Also, why isn't anywhere green? How big are these forests? I don't know. It makes it difficult for me to connect with this map. And despite that, you can already see that, I'm coming up with world ideas just based off of this simple map. But it doesn't have a lot of really exciting stuff beyond those 2 kingdoms. Also, there's no cities or civilizations on the coast, which is weird. I don't really understand that. Again, maybe I'm just a nerd. I mean, if you look at a population map of the United States, there's the East Coast, there's the West Coast, and then there's everything in between. The population density just tends to cluster around these bodies of water because we use them for transportation. They're great sources of food. So maybe there's a reason in this world, like, we can't live by the coast because of the sea monsters summoned by the evil wizard or something. I don't know. You could make it work. But the map itself just doesn't have a lot of compelling information. I can't see a lot of reasons why I would travel to different places unless I was going to go defeat the evil wizard. And if that's the case, then the rest of the map just doesn't really matter. So if you're not going to put time and effort and energy into making a really compelling map, maybe just don't really worry about it. It's totally okay to just put something together like this and slap some names on it and go with it and use really compelling storytelling methods instead. But it can be really helpful to have that visual representation of what's going on as you're doing your world building. And also just be mindful of how your map looks. Like, these individual tiny trees are very confusing to me. Maybe I'm just too literal, but like, are there 3 trees in the southeast that just exist? Is that a thing? I don't get it. And again, maybe I'm just weird, but I don't like this map. Let's look at a map that I do like. So this map is topographical, which means that you can extrapolate how tall different points of the mountain ranges are based on how it's shaped, and it also shows you the waterways. And one of the things that I really like about that is that you can clearly understand why it is difficult to traverse from one place to another. Obviously, this is from Lord of the Rings. So there's a big mountain range that goes in between Gondor and Rohan, and that mountain range serves an important story purpose because you have the beacons that light across it. Spoiler alert, I guess, for Lord of the Rings. Whatever. But because of that physical barrier in between the two kingdoms, you can understand why they aren't like constantly at war with each other, because they don't vie for the same resources. They have access to different things because this mountain range comes between them, and it would be really difficult to, like climb over the mountain to go steal stuff from Rohan when it's easier to just, go south where there's less people and you don't have to go over a mountain. So there are fewer conflicts, but you can understand that there's tension between them because they do share a waterway, and they could potentially become enemies if one of them was ever short of resources, because they could get to each other if they needed to. Speaking of the river is really great because it creates this physical barrier in between the lands of men and the lands of Mordor and the bad guys, right? And so we have this physical river that cuts off the easy passage between these two places, which creates these interesting points of conflict around bridges and places where the river might be shallow enough to ford and things like that. And over in Mordor, we have this massive rock edifice that goes up to a plateau. And plateaus are really cool because they're big, flat, rocky areas. So you can understand how Mordor sort of looms over the rest of the lands of men. And you have this like physical disparity between the dark, shadowy, monstrous land looming over the lands of men below. And that's really cool. And if you don't know how to read this kind of a map, then you're not going to get all this information. It's just going to look like a whole bunch of squiggles. But if you understand how to read a topographical map, it gives you a ton of cool information and detail about this world and how these different places might interact with each other and what it all means. Or maybe I'm just a nerd. I could just be a nerd. Let's be honest. Anyway, so this map is an example of a map that gives us lots of information. It's also matched with the world that I already know, so I'm predisposed to find meaning in these different places. But like the dead marshes, you've got this little marsh up here, and it gives you a different access point and different places to go. There's this Dagorlad, the battle plain. Like, that sounds really cool. What is that all about? And like, you want to know more about this Udun place and how does this all fit together? I love maps that have names on them because it helps you give weight and importance to a place so that people can sort of buy into it a little more and look at a map and be like, oh, what's going on in Fenmarch? What's that place all about? And as a world builder, you may not know right away. You may just like put in some little dots and say, this is the dead marshes. And then your player character's like, what is a dead marsh? And you're like, oh, I guess I should figure out what a dead marsh is. Like, that's totally fine too. I find that it's better to put more stuff in a map and then take it out later if you need to, or expand on it as your players show interest in it. And obviously this map was for a novel, which means that the author was already doing all of this world building and they knew the extent to which they were going to go into these different places. When you're doing your role playing, you have a little more flexibility because you can respond to what your player's interested in and you can fill in the map with more details as you go, and you can use this map as a source of inspiration for how you proceed. Okay, let's talk about lack of complexity. And I'm going to talk about Star Wars because I haven't done that yet this video. So you have single biome planets in Star Wars, which are not super realistic, but they are easier to use, and when you're building tons and tons of planets, it's easier to build a single biome. You can make up for that by making them interesting and putting interesting things in them. The Star Wars method of interesting things is to put interesting people and interesting technology in places. And that's why Tatooine pretty much is exactly the same as a jungle planet, except it's dry. Like, there's not really a lot of thought that goes into, well, how does moisture farming work, and how do the civilizations deal with sandstorms, and how do they deal with travel and stuff like that? Like, what does it mean to have two suns? It just doesn't go into all that because that's not the point of Star Wars. I think you can pretty much sum up Tatooine with, I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. And that's pretty much Tatooine in a nutshell. They don't really go into a lot of the depth behind it and explain why Tatooine is the way that it is. Because the interesting things in Tatooine are the people and the plot. This is contrasted by something like Dune, where Dune Arrakis is in and of itself one of the characters of the series. And you can argue, oh, but of course it's more complex because it's from a book series. But that's not my point. My point is, Duke Leto, not particularly interesting. Jessica, moderately interesting. The people themselves are pretty cool. But what makes them interesting is how they interact with the environment of Dune. If this story took place on Caladan, it would be a totally different experience, right? Because you wouldn't be dealing with sandworms, you would be dealing with ocean storms, right? So having this different locale is what makes the characters more interesting, and learning about the different technologies and the way that these people who live on Arrakis have adapted to it is very fascinating. And then throughout the course of the series, if you read past the first couple of books, you get to see what the terraforming looks like in the long term. By adding all of that complexity into the environment, this space itself becomes the interesting thing. When you invest more in the geography, it makes it easier to take a flatter character and put them into a more interesting environment to see how they react and how they respond and how they adapt to the environment and how they adapt the environment to their needs. So whether you want to go the route of focusing on your characters or stories or focusing on your environment, what really matters is that you focus on something. You got to make something interesting about this place, because if the most interesting thing about your place is the people in it, then you really need to invest in the people in that place. Otherwise, it's going to fall flat. And if you want to focus more on how your player characters are going to be interacting with the geography, then you can spend less time digging into the complexities of your characters and focus more on how the function of the geography is going to impact them and impede them from achieving their goals. Both are totally viable options. You can go either direction. And if you're going for a more simple geographical build, then going with a single biome planet, totally fine. And I think in a science fiction campaign, it's probably better to go with a more simple environment if you're planning on doing a lot of planet hopping. Because if you're pouring tons and tons of energy into developing a planet and its biomes and all that kind of stuff, just to have your player characters walk in, do one dungeon and leave, that's probably not the best use of your time and energy. But if you are going to be spending a lot of time on a single planet, in a single town, in a single city, you can also really dig into that. Now, scale is another thing that I haven't even touched on. So I'm going to save scale and discussion about that for another video where we talk about different methods of map making and stuff like that. But yeah, I think this is a pretty good place to end it. We've talked about some historical explanations for how history can impact things. We've talked about some of the pitfalls and ways that you can overcome them by creating more interesting, more in-depth geographical features. And overall, I hope you enjoyed listening to me be a total nerd about a couple different things that I like a lot. Because I am a big nerd about a lot of different things. So this is the official end of the episode. Next time in episode 7, I think we should do it. I think we should build a world, and I think we're going to start with a sci-fi, and I'm going to walk you through my process, and yeah, it'll be great. It's going to be a very long episode. It'll be fine. Everything's fine. So thank you again for watching, and if you'd care to stick around, we're going to take a trip to the Cascadon Corner. I feel like it would sort of be a cop-out if I didn't show you my map. So this is a political map, which means that it shows you the different countries, which doesn't necessarily have all the cities and towns and stuff, but it shows you the different kingdoms and how they all relate to each other. And it shows you some of the natural barriers that come between them and how the landscape changes. So you can imagine if there was a satellite over my world, this is kind of what it would see. Let's start with Padallac. Padallac is a desert nation. It has lots of coast, but it's not actually viable coast because of 3,000 years ago, this Australia-sized chunk of land was broken away from the Pangaea by an unnatural thing that happened. It's very complicated and it's not important, but they don't have a lot of viable coast, so they're not a very big nation. But they are adjacent to Dunalane, and you can see how the desert sort of blends into Dunalane, so you get the idea that it sort of naturally shifts from this more arid place into a more green, lush place, and Dunalane is a much more humid environment because the heat gets trapped in between these two mountain ranges, and Dunalane is a big, massive expanse of flat land. This flat land is fantastic for farming and travel and raising livestock and stuff like that, and they also don't have a lot of coastline, so they are pretty self-sufficient. They could probably survive pretty okay on their own if they didn't have access to trade with other kingdoms. In between Dunalane and Vestria is Shidara, which is this little sliver of a kingdom that exists in this little divide between these two mountain ranges. And these little mountain ranges are kind of cute. They're part of the consequence of this earth-shattering event that happened. Literally earth-shattering. Anyway, not important. So the Shadaran Kingdom doesn't have a lot of land, which means they're very resource poor. But what they lack in farmable lands, they make up for in having lots of forests, which are full of lumber and animals, which means they have meat and leather, which are really great things for trading to these other kingdoms that might not necessarily have access to the same quantities of that stuff that you get from the woods. The woods are also magical and enchanted, but that's not important right now. Beside Shidara is Vestria, which has a massive coastline, so you can tell this is probably a people who spend a lot of time out at sea. They're kind of my fake Italy. They also have these cool little islands that they also possess, and they do stuff there too, which isn't important because my game isn't taking place there. But because they value trade so highly, they tend to remain neutral in all things, and they want everybody to get along so that everybody has money to spend on all of the stuff that they can ship. They also have silk farms, because I found out that silk would work well in their environment. This whole continent is in the southern hemisphere because it is inspired by Australia. So the areas of Vestria, Shidara, and Dunalane are sort of Mediterranean heat. They have vineyards and things like that. So they're very warm, very, very nice places to exist. Vestria doesn't get as much of the calm weather like Dunalane does, because Vestria doesn't have that break from the wind, which makes it a little bit harder for them to do some of the agriculture that Dunalane can. And in the middle of my little map is Cascadon. Cascadon cuts a line across the kingdom. It starts off in this little valley in the impassable mountains, and then it cuts straight across. And if you've watched my other videos, you heard a little bit about the history of Cascadon and how it came to be. But basically, Cascadon took over the southern part of Dunalane and then marched over and started taking land from Hestrian. Now, we are currently in a drought in my world. We're in a heat wave. So the snowy lands of Hestrian have become boggy and marshy, and that's what this sort of sickly yellow and dark area are. This is a watershed where the big water systems that come out of the mountains sort of seep through the ground. It's not really great for a lot of farming, but it's great for stuff like tubers, which can grow pretty much anywhere that you have rocks. So all of the people who live in this sort of sickly yellow area, they're again going to be very dependent on trade because they will have limited resources. That marshy ground isn't going to be great for cattle and things like that. But they do have access to the coastline, which means they can do fishing and things like that. Below that yellow sickly area is the ice nation of Hestrine, which has, snow. And then it's separated from the rest of the continent by these mountain ranges and marshes. And they also don't have a lot of coastline because this whole corner down here is a giant cliff. If this was a topographical map, the highest points of a non-mountain would be that most southeastern tip of Hestrine. And they share their mountain range with Cadessi, which you can tell by the map is a place full of trees. The Cadessi people actually live exclusively on the water and the shore because they've entered into a deal with the Fae who own the forest of Cadessi, and the Fae are like, yeah, you can have the river, but if you come out of the shore and into the forest, your life is forfeit. Which I just think is fun. And they do have a port down at the very southern end, which is a cliff port. I know, my names, they're so original. It sounds cooler in Cadessian, I promise. Anyway, so that's what my map looks like, and you can tell that I've spent a lot of time and energy thinking about it because this is a decade-plus old design that I've been working on and refining, and these explanations didn't all come before I made the map, and they didn't all come after I made the map. Some of them came sort of as a process of making the map, where I had to justify why things were the way they were, and I had to come up with stories to help them make sense. So whether you're making a super simple map or a very complex, accurate map or something more general, the real key here is to make a map that makes sense for you and give meaning to the things that are in there by building stories up around them. People shouldn't be scratching their heads going, wait, is there only one tree or is there an actual forest, right? You should make it clear what you're trying to convey with your map. So thank you again for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed everything, and if you liked it, like it. If you want to subscribe. Everything is helpful and appreciated, and I look forward to building a world with you next time. Okay, bye!